Howdy folks, and welcome back to the Sunshine State Rails, specifically the rails of Florida's Bone Valley, one of the very interesting regions in the United States where phosphorus rock is mined and transported to both processing plants and the overall American market, as well as overseas to many other countries. What we have here is one of the dragline buckets. This is what they use to pull that phosphate out of the ground. You can fit 2 full-size SUVs in this thing. That, paired with all of the other railroad operations in this area of Central Florida, are quite interesting. So follow along with me as we take a look at CSX's Bone Valley region. Central Florida's Bone Valley phosphate mining region includes what I'd argue is some of the most unique railroading in the United States. Florida has always had a high content of phosphorus within the soil, and folks who found this out over 100 years ago have since been utilizing this area to mine phosphorus and transport it to market. You're currently watching one of CSX's shuttle trains passing by Mosaic's New Wales plant, and this is what we'll come to know soon as one of the many processing plants in the Bone Valley. This roughly 60 square mile area of phosphate railroading has always been a fascination, but plenty of Bone Valley content exists today, so we're going to go through this video with the intention of answering 3 main questions. The first being to define the common key terms, wet rock, dry rock, and DAP. And once we know what those are, how does wet rock become dry rock? And third, how does the railroad assist in transporting the finished product of all this to market? In the process of answering these 3 loaded questions, we're going to see plenty of videos I've shot around the Bone Valley in the last 5 years or so, along with a handful of minute details that make this stretch of railroading so unique. Our journey will begin here on a cool morning in March at the yard alongside US 41 at the Mosaic Riverview facility. Called East Tampa by the railroad, Mosaic Riverview is another processing or chemical plant, this one positioned right on the banks of the Alafaya River, making it a strategic location to export finished fertilizer via Tampa Bay, which on one side of the Bone Valley's business model is the name of the game. As we'll find, these chemical plants are the final step of the process before the finished fertilizer can be sent out by rail or overseas. Serving the Riverview plant this morning, courtesy of CSX, is train B339. 339 is a turn job of wet rock hoppers out of East Tampa carrying empties back to a mine in Hardee County and returning later in the day with loads for the processing plant here. On this morning, we find a pair of CM44 locomotives coming out of Yeoman down to here at East Tampa to pick up an empty train. Once across 41 and in the yard, the crew will get their waybills and paperwork for which of these cars are set to go back to the mines. So, before we get too far into the definition, B339 is a wet rock unit train. They'll soon be on their way back out with a train of empty cars. The consist is hastily put together, and before we know it, B339 is back on the move out of East Tampa, bound for a mine in Hardee County. These CSX-owned hoppers, rebuilt in the early 2000s by Tampa's project shop specifically for use on wet rock trains, are never quite a welcome sight crossing US 41 at any time of the day at around 5 miles per hour. As we roll out of Riverview bound for the very rural Bone Valley region, let's take a look at the first of 2 maps that I'll be using in this video. This one a more broad view of the entire area we'll be working with, the second a more detailed map made by my buddy Christian. We are currently on the very west side of the map, ironically at East Tampa, and now is the time to familiarize ourselves with a couple of key terms, those being phosphate mines and processing plants. The 2 have their own specific function, and for phosphate mines, the 2 rail-served facilities that remain on this map are at Four Corners and Fort Meade. As for the processing plants to follow, the 3 remaining are at Ridgewood, New Wales, and East Tampa. And wet rock, which is the commodity that our train is set to go retrieve, can only be obtained at a phosphate mine, and via the route you see here on screen, 339 is bound for the Four Corners mine via Brewster and Ag Rock Yard. Once out of industrial Tampa, B339's first turn towards the Bone Valley would come at south end Valrico, otherwise known as Valrico Junction. This is the beginning of the Valrico subdivision, branching out of the Yeoman subdivision from Tampa, headed towards Plant City and Vitus. South of Valrico and Mulberry, all tracks of the Bone Valley except for a small section of this Valrico sub is track warrant controlled dark territory, meaning that all trains operating in the region must have explicit permission from dispatch to do so, and only one train may occupy specified limits at a time. So while I didn't get this radio call out recorded, 339 would have just received a track warrant from dispatch to operate from here at South End Valrico down roughly to milepost SVC 853, which are the switches off the main line at Ag Rock. The Valrico subdivision is also the longest continuous subdivision still intact in the BV, running from Valrico Junction all the way around and down to the end of track in Bowling Green near Mosaic, Fort Meade. Though 339 would only need about 8 more miles of it down to Edison Junction, where they would turn south onto the Brewster sub to Bradley, which is where we would head next. Considering that this whole backwoods community is called Bradley Junction, Florida, it's pretty obvious what the one and only attraction, so to speak, is here. While not so much today, Bradley Junction has always been known as one of the Bone Valley hotspots, as 3 different routes converge here. From the west, turning south is the Brewster subdivision to Ag Rock and Arcadia. To the north, the Aiken sub to downtown Mulberry. And to the east is the Agricola Spur, presently serving only one customer and used for storage of cars. But one of the more unique parts about Bradley Junction, and the entire Bone Valley for that matter, is the radio-assisted power switches that are present at every leg of this Y. Since dispatch cannot control any electronic components within this dark territory region, these radio-assisted switches were installed about 10 years ago to speed trains on their routes through the BV. With a lack of dispatcher control, these switches are controlled in short range via radio signals transmitted by the locomotive operator. This prevents them from having to stop and line the switches by hand. It saves a lot of time and strain on your back, as the aforementioned was a common practice in the Bone Valley before the implementation of this technology. The LED lights that accompany each switch are indicators to the train crew at a distance what position the switch is in, either green for normal or yellow for reversed. Now, the terms normal and reversed are in relation to the railroad's route and not which way the rails are actually pointed. So in this case, while it may appear that the switch is in the open or reversed position because the rails are bent, the switch is actually in the normal position as indicated because the normal route here is the Brewster subdivision, which turns to the south here. When observing railroad switches, always consider what is the main line. If your switch is going to keep you on the main line, even if it is technically curved, it's more than likely in the normal position, as we see here with B339 taking that straight but curved routing onto the Brewster sub towards Ag Rock. The old Road 37 and the subsequent Fort Greene Road that follow the Brewster sub south provide a number of scenic and remote locations to pull off and see the seldom train movement running to Ag Rock. Middle of nowhere scenes like this are quite common in the Bone Valley and haven't changed much in the last 20 years. But the Bone Valley itself certainly has. The cavalcade of companies that used to operate out here, including CF Industries, Mulberry Phosphates, Agrifos, IMC, Cargill, and many others, have since all downsized and merged into the monopolized Mosaic. Though quite a few trains are still running around the region, as phosphate is still a very prevalent resource in the state. And chasing trains in the Bone Valley is rather easy, as speed limits on lines don't usually top more than 35 miles per hour, so if you can catch a train side by side like I did on this day, B339 is a fun train to chase along Fort Greene Road. But be very careful. The old Highway 37, which becomes Fort Greene Road, crisscrosses over the Brewster Sub about 3 times, and right before Ag Rock it does so once again. So if you're pacing him along this Fort Greene stretch, you're gonna get caught right about here.
B339 to Ag Rock. Go ahead, 339.
It's right about now that 339 calls ahead to Mosaic Ag Rock for permission into the yard.
Yeah, coming to you. Got 78 empties for you.
Alright, come in A1A, back up 1. You got 81 loads on track 2.
Alright, it's 1A, come back up 1, and 81 loads from track 2.
Turning off the Brewster subdivision via another radio remote switch, train 339 now arrives into Ag Rock Yard, and while this isn't the site of the mine, Ag Rock is the destination of the CSX train. The conglomerate Mosaic owns both the yard and the railroad that moves the wet rock consists between Ag Rock and the mine, or more specifically, the washing and sifting facilities. See, while the wet rock product is retrieved by rail at the aforementioned Four Corners and Fort Meade facilities, the initial material is actually being dug out of the earth multiple zip codes away. In rural Hardee County, in one of those you'd never find it on your own kind of places, one of the Mosaic drag lines can be seen digging phosphate right out of the earth. Around 7 miles east of Wauchula, this area is part of the Hardee County expansion for the facility in Fort Meade. This scarred landscape, now called the Eastern Reserves, used to belong to local farmers before Mosaic bought the staggering 19,000 acres for the expansion of their Fort Meade reserves. Standing at the height of the boom, nearly 180 feet high, these massive walking drag lines claw phosphate rock out of the earth with these massive buckets nearly the size of a 2-car garage. They are currently mining the layer of earth that is referred to as the matrix. The matrix layer is a mixture of phosphate rock, sands, and clays. The phosphate rock is extremely valuable and has a multitude of uses, including its presence in ceramic paints, electronics, gypsum drywall, laundry detergents, toothpaste, soft drinks, and that which is most important to Mosaic, nutrient-rich plant fertilizers. The matrix layer seen here cannot be refined into a usable form straight from the earth, so it will first be transported to the Four Corners and Fort Meade sifting plants for its initial filter. After extraction, the matrix layer is combined with water to form a slurry, after which it is pumped through 20-inch steel pipes to the sifting plants at Four Corners and Fort Meade. There, the mix is sifted to remove large particles and excess soil, and from this point in this state, the phosphate begins to travel by rail. Once the product has been loaded onto respective rail cars, Mosaic will then haul the loaded train back to Ag Rock Yard for interchange back to CSX. After just over 6 hours of loading inside Four Corners, Mosaic hauls the loaded train 9 miles from Four Corners to Ag Rock, at which point they'll put a call in to CSX to come get the train when a crew is available. As the Mosaic job arrives at Ag Rock, they're directed onto the northernmost track in this east-west yard, as the entire train's weight must be recorded before it can be handed off to CSX and ultimately delivered to another Mosaic plant. A roughly 20-foot section of rail cut separate from all the rest atop an electronic scale calculates the weight of each car as the trucks roll over this separated piece. After each car has been weighed, the crew will shove it all back to yard and store the consist. A sample of the wet rock will then be taken at each terminal to check its grade. The grade is based on the amount of magnesium oxide in the mix. The higher the concentration, the lower the grade, and rock quality tends to drop the farther south you dig. If the grade is too low, it can't be processed at the East Tampa or Ridgewood facilities. In such case, the loads will go to New Wales, as they can handle almost any grade thanks to their more advanced processing systems, which remove more of these impurities. With all of this in mind, we can now define basically all of the key terms. In this wet and sifted state, the phosphate is called wet rock, the first term. From here in this state, it must be transported by rail to one of the 3 processing plants where it will be mixed with chemicals like sulfuric acid to create phosphoric acid for the following terms: dry rock phosphate and DAP. Now, it's important to note that dry rock, DAP, and diammonium phosphate all mean the same thing. This is the finished fertilizer product ready for export. DAP simply abbreviates diammonium phosphate, and dry rock is simply an antonym for wet rock used to directly distinguish the dry finished product from the wet slurry. B339, now back on the Brewster sub out of Ag Rock, loaded with the slurry, passes by Mosaic's New Wales processing plant. This facility at one time was the largest phosphate processing plant in the world. Millions of tons of phosphate is produced and exported from this plant each year. Another Bone Valley train that is a nightly visitor to New Wales is symboled L769. A local job originating out of CSX's Winston Yard at Lakeland, we've set up for them tonight at the Lithia Pinecrest Road crossing on a very rainy and stormy night in June. At 15 minutes to midnight, what used to be one of the Bone Valley's most iconic trains enters New Wales under the desolate moonlight. .769 in this shot is shuttling a short train of jumbo-covered hoppers back to the processing plant here at New Wales. These cars are now empty, having returned from customers up north that have just received finished diammonium phosphate. The train, which a few years ago used to be symboled 0730 and ran in the middle of the day, shuttles these empty jumbo hoppers and loaded molten sulfur tanks from the yard at Winston to here at New Wales. These cars will eventually be loaded with more diammonium phosphate to head back to customers further up north. New Wales and Lithia Pinecrest Road, even at 12:31 in the morning, is still quite a busy area. The sheer size of the New Wales facility warrants loading operations to be happening inside around the clock. The size of the New Wales plant is especially evident here under the now lost moonlight of this very stormy night, as tanker trucks also loaded with molten sulfur arrive at this facility all night long. Train L769 spends about 2.5 hours in the plant sifting through loads and empties to set aside and build a roughly 35-car train to head back north with them to Winston this night. It's 3:02 a.m. before they're on the move again, with their quad of BNSF locomotives now crossing Lithia Pinecrest with their fairly short train of finished dry rock phosphate bound for customers up north in the States. The rain is still just barely falling as 769 gets their move on, so it's a good thing those fertilizer cars are covered. For one more shot of the train, somewhat at speed, I move a few miles up the line, northeast past Edison Junction to the site of the old Nichols phosphate mine. We'll revisit Nichols a little later on, but I'll say now that it's about as quiet here at 3 a.m. as it would be at 3 p.m. That is, of course, until a train shows up. Empty sulfur tank cars from New Wales would also usually return on this train, but none would be coming out tonight. Around 2 miles east, 769 will turn off the Valrico sub at Mulberry and drop these loaded hoppers into one of the yards there known as Prairie. There they'll be staged and eventually combined with another set of loaded cars from the Ridgewood plant to create a full-size unit train bound for customers up north and the fertile farmlands of the North American continent. With no other traffic returning to Winston, 769 would run engines light back to the yard after dropping these cars in Prairie.
3309 L76914 BSF 4222 MA Anderson, restoring all tracks between SAS, North IMC, and North Bradley Yard limits. Is that correct, over? That's right.
So what does a Bone Valley unit train look like that isn't operating in the Bone Valley? Well, let's take a look. A long time ago, longer now than it seems, I was set up at one of my favorite spots along CSX's Wildwood subdivision, had a spot that I'm starting to call Rural Wordell, and approaching is a train that can only be recognized as a Bone Valley staple. We are now quite the distance from the Bone Valley, around 12 miles north of Dade City, Florida, as train B207 rumbles north on track 2 past the Rurdell crossovers in the very rural backwoods of Sumter County. It's a solid train of jumbo-covered hoppers, all loaded full of finished diammonium phosphate from the New Wales and Ridgewood processing plants. 207 is now hauling that shipment out of Florida bound for Chicago, Illinois, and handoff to a foreign road. When emptied, all of these jumbo hoppers will return to the Bone Valley as another unit train of their own. Though the production of that fertilizer is impossible without the delivery of wet rock from the Bone Valley, so let's head back south to Durant. Passing through the tiny community south of Valrico is B339, loaded with the wet product bound for the Riverview facility on Tampa Bay. Durant, Florida used to be a major turning point for the former Seaboard Airline Railroad. Once a connection to their Sarasota subdivision to Venice, tracks to Turkey Creek were ripped up after the merger of the SAL and ACL roads in 1967, and all tracks south to Wimauma from here removed shortly after the 1980s creation of CSX. And some of the only remaining trackage of that subdivision still intact today includes the 6.5-mile stretch between Parrish and Willow, now owned by Florida Power and Light, operated by the Florida Railroad Museum. But as for Durant, while it used to be a major passenger station and diverging point, all that remains today is a singular storage track and the Valrico subdivision on a slight grade. Durant is still quite a unique Floridian backwoods community, though I imagine it's downsized greatly since its heyday. It, like many other Florida towns that have since lost their glamour, hosts nothing more than a post office, a gas station with 2 pumps, a food market, and a pharmacy from the 50s. B339 is hauling a product through town with a story just as old, past mile SZ5, only 5 miles from Valrico Junction. For which I'll include this video of a loaded B339 returning through Valrico in March of 2022. Often your final warning for trains approaching Valrico is the defect detector a couple miles away at milepost 2.3, changed recently to mile 2.2.
CSX detector, milepost 2.3, no defects. Repeat, no defects.
Now converging back onto the Yeoman subdivision, the S-Line, B339 is now on their westerly track to Tampa and then south to East Tampa at the Riverview facility. Unique about the Riverview plant, though, is that because it sits right on the Alafia River, when the processing is completed, the finished product can go straight on to an awaiting ship on the river instead of having to travel by rail between the plant and the port or a customer. But the same can't be said for this next train. Speaking of Tampa, it's another very hot day in June as we're mounted on top of the Orient Road overpass overlooking Yeoman Yard in Tampa. This is CSX's major freight terminus in Hillsborough County, sorting all of the manifest merchandise traffic bound for all of the Floridian zip codes surrounding Tampa Bay. There is almost always action here around the clock as rail cars need to constantly be sifted and sorted to make it to their proper destinations in a timely manner. Included in that action this morning, coming up the Yeoman Yard bypass track, is train B311, shuttling a train of empty dry rock hoppers back to a processing plant in the Bone Valley.
B311, 217801, clear YN. sub northbound.
Converging onto the Yeoman sub here at control point YN, 311 is fresh out of CSX's Rockport C terminal and is shuttling these empty cars back to Mosaic's Ridgewood processing plant. Rockport is not a Mosaic terminal, but is rather a CSX yard at which commodities like potash and DAP are transloaded from rail to ship. Unlike the site at Riverview, there is no processing plant present at Rockport, so the finished product must be brought in from somewhere else. In around 7 miles, B311 will too turn south at Valrico onto the Valrico sub, then it's another 20 miles east to Ridgewood. The Valrico sub would take the train south back through Durant, Edison Junction, and eventually to where we'd set up next at Nichols plant. I say Nichols plant, but there hasn't been an active plant or mine here in over 20 years. All constructed in 1905 by the Nichols Phosphate Mining Company, the entire town was centered around this facility built to house the workers and their families. The town was named Nichols for its proximity to the site of Fort Nichols used during the Seminole Wars. The entire town grew around the phosphate industry before ultimately closing in the 1960s, and the plant itself closing by August of 2000 under the hands of Agrifos Mining LLC. In a story told all too many times in this Bone Valley region, the land was simply extracted of all it had to give, so the phosphate plant no longer had any utility in this location. As we see here with B311 bypassing the storage track and what used to be the economic driver of this now forgotten community.
Dakota, multicolored films, I see you.
With a distant friend at the controls, B311 is now coming into downtown Mulberry, which is actually part of the only signaled trackage here in the Bone Valley. From the north end of IMC siding, east 5.5 miles across the diamond at Mulberry and into the siding at Ridgewood is the only signaled trackage in this whole region. In regards to downtown Mulberry, I'll include this clip I shot in January of 2021 of the aforementioned 0730 crossing the Mulberry interlocking on the Bone Valley subdivision. I'm also including this for the reason that back then, this very small area of signaled territory was all still guarded by USNS color light signals, and the two at the diamond crossing on the Bone Valley side were of the Y pattern style. After CSX sold off its Tallahassee sub between Baldwin and New Orleans, these became the last two active Y-pattern color lights left on CSX in Florida. By the end of 2023, all of the USNS signals at IMC, Mulberry, and Ridgewood would all be replaced with modern heads. Downtown Mulberry is still quite a unique spot though, as while today the signals may look different, the Diamond Crossing hasn't gone anywhere. The Bone Valley subdivision from Winston and Prairie crosses the Valrico subdivision here at grade right in the middle of the Highway 37 crossing. The Bone Valley sub is currently taking this 0730 down south to the Aiken sub and Bradley Junction. The east-west Valrico sub is the line that our B311 to Ridgewood plant is currently on, and the siding of Ridgewood is only about 4 miles to our east. The siding at Ridgewood is also the location of the Ridgewood Y, that is the yard lead to the Ridgewood chemical plant. Looking south from here at the stem of the Y, to the left is the Valrico sub to Bartow and the mine at Fort Meade, and to the right is the Valrico sub to Mulberry, IMC, Nichols, and Edison. Once confirmation is given upon a plan and permission in from a Ridgewood employee, B311 is able to enter the plant, ensuring that the radio power switch at the stem of the Y is normaled for their movement in.
Stem of Ridgewood, normal. Ridgewood, airport train, we here, we got 46 for you. Hey, we'll come up track 20 and drop them off. Swing the wire and come back to the plant. Alright, here we go, appreciate it.
Now crossing State Road 60, B311 will drop these empties further back in the plant before retrieving a set of loaded cars full of dry rock phosphate to haul all the way back to Rockport. These cars in question, nicknamed GR1s, were custom rebuilds by Tampa's project shop in the early 2000s for specific use on these dry rock shuttle trains and for use inside Rockport's rotary dumper. Each of these cars are fitted with rotary couplers so that this machine can literally flip them upside down in place to dump their loads into a pit, which is the same way the tops of these cars flip open via gravity, which is why they're called flip-top hoppers. They are certainly quite unique, and you won't find them in service anywhere else on CSX. Almost as unique as the Ridgewood plant itself, Ridgewood is one of the 3 remaining phosphate processing plants active in the Bone Valley. There used to be well over 20 of these chemical plants in the region, but as reserves ran dry and fortunes changed, everything consolidated and moved to the present remaining 3. Like East Tampa and New Wales, Ridgewood is the 3rd site where the freshly mined wet rock is processed via chemical mixing into dry rock fertilizer. But unlike East Tampa, no ships can dock at the site of Ridgewood, so the phosphate must be transported by rail back to the bay, and such is the job of train B311. Though the port train could not receive the finished fertilizer here had it not come raw just a few days before from a washer plant about 20 miles away. At milepost AX883 is the interchange yard to Mosaic Fort Meade, the second and only other rail-served sifting plant in the region.
10, 5. Good, quick, I'll stretch it.
This afternoon, job symboled B361 is retrieving a train load of freshly mined wet rock to haul back to the processing plant at Ridgewood. Serving the same purpose as the facilities at Four Corners, Fort Meade filters and sifts the phosphorus slurry that has just been piped in from open pits before loading it onto rail cars. As the loads now depart from the washer, we see the train crossing the giant concrete bridge that CSX built over the Peace River for this customer alone. It shows the importance of this nutrient-rich commodity to the rail industry. This track is technically designated the Fort Meade Spur, as it's a sort of branch off the main Rico subdivision running 2 miles eastward to the sifting plant. Though the Rico sub dead ends in the dirt only a mile south of here at Bowling Green. Once upon a time, this was the Atlantic coastline's Lakeland to Fort Myers main line. Now only seeing a handful of Bone Valley wet rock trains as far as southern Fort Meade. Here at West Broadway Street in downtown Fort Meade, 361 passes by the red brick former ACL depot still standing by the tracks. Now an extension to the Peace River Packing Company's warehouses. Across the street is the Fort Meade Historical Museum. They've got quite a few railroad artifacts on display, as well as a wood pavilion for live music and events, as well as one of the dragline buckets that are on display at many different museums around this Bone Valley area. 4.5 miles north of town in a literally twisted feat of geography, the tracks bend underneath US 98, switching back over to former Seaboard trackage, starting the series of SV mileposts. The former company routes were more or less favorable to the north or south of this point, so the two were eventually conjoined in this giant S-curve beneath the highway. A few miles further, and we're in suburban Bartow, and on the north side of town the tracks will turn dead west towards Ridgewood.
On the Ridgewood. Yes, sir. We got 88 cars waiting. Like, see if we can get permission in, send it by D-rails down. Yes, sir. D-rails is like it today. All right, D-rails down. Got permission in. Edison. Input.
Now back at State Road 60, B361 arrives to Ridgewood plant with their wet rock loads from Fort Meade, and now with the raw material arriving to the plant, it will now be processed into dry rock fertilizer, at which point a Tampa or Winston crew will come out here to retrieve at a later date. But no matter what train it is crossing State Road 60 in or out of Ridgewood, it's never a welcome sight to resident motorists, as these trains will back up traffic for almost a mile in each direction as they cross. Just beyond the road crossings, the train swings hard right, as the unloader building is on the far side of the plant. Over there they have two sets of conveyor belts, one that will bring the phosphate straight into the processing plant, the other that will stack the wet rock sky high in these dark mounds of their on-site reserves. If I'm not mistaken, this pile is used to load over-the-road trucks that will take this wet rock over to New Wales or East Tampa for further processing there. For the most part though, this is all for us to see here at Ridgewood until the finished fertilizer is ready to go. We'd catch one of the dry rock shuttles a bit further west on the Valrico sub, but on the way there I'm going to stop to include this video from March of 2023, as you can no longer see the signal pictured here today. At Royster Mine Road, just a mile to the west of Ridgewood, visible is the former ABS signal for the distance signal to Mulberry headed west. While the signal is still there today, the USNS model visible here has since been replaced with a modern safe train aluminum mast. The signal is not a control point, so it is only lit when a train enters the block, that being the north end of Ridgewood's siding. Coming west past the signal towards Mulberry is wet rock shuttle symboled B371. Like B361, 371 is wet rock loads from the Fort Meade washer plant, this job shuttling the loads to Mosaic, New Wales for processing there. The train will follow the Valrico sub to the west, turning south at Edison Junction onto the Brewster sub to access the plant. In the present day, on a different day, we would also move slightly west on the Valrico sub to the signaled control point of South End IMC siding. It's another blazing day in June as we're set up here for the return of B311. Now, after having retrieved a set of loaded GR1 cars full of DAP fertilizer from the Ridgewood chemical plant, they're now on the return trip to Rockport Yard in Tampa. 2 CM44 locomotives would lead the charge this day. The siding of IMC here and the Ridgewood siding about 4 miles from us are the only 2 signaled sidings in the entire Bone Valley, and dark territory begins only another mile from here at the other end of this siding at North End IMC. I'd quickly begin to follow the B311 out of Mulberry down Nichols Road, passing North End IMC, and following the road all the way down to the former Nichols mine again, where the train would catch me at a road crossing, as this road crosses the Valrico sub about 3 times before Edison. It was right about this time that my radio started giving me some valuable information regarding another Bone Valley train that was currently working inside the New Wales chemical plant, preparing to pull a train of dry rock hoppers to Rockport right behind B311, so I knew that Edison Junction would be the perfect place to catch them both. Even just 5 years ago, the earlier visited Bradley Junction was one of the hottest locations to see trains in the Bone Valley, but with recent trends that I've been following and the way that I believe certain routes have changed, I'd say that Edison Junction is now the busiest single location to see trains in the Bone Valley today. Positioned around 2 miles northwest of the New Wales processing plant, Edison is where the Brewster sub from Ag Rock ties into the Valrico sub from Valrico and Mulberry. Setting up at Edison Road looking east, the Valrico sub branches to the left while the Brewster sub is on the right. The Brewster sub takes you back to New Wales, Bradley Junction, Ag Rock, and ultimately Arcadia. Each of the 3 switches here at Edison are also radio remote switches, but just like all machines, these too occasionally malfunction. And today, the switch on the north leg would not be responding to radio signals, meaning they had to stop, get out, and manually line it for their move. Though this is just a small glimpse into the days of old, as before these came along, every switch in the Bone Valley had to be manually operated. The radio remote switches, obviously when they work, are pretty handy tools when rail fanning the Bone Valley with the radio, as they will respond to the commands of engineers with both the switch location, milepost, and position it has been set to. Here's an example of what the switch on the east side of Edison sounds like when responding to commands from a locomotive.
CSX, South Y Edison, milepost 836.2, switch is reverse. Switch is reverse. CSX, South Y Edison, out.
Switch, stem of Edison is in a normal position, out.
That second switch you heard is the switch at the stem of Edison Y on the Brewster sub side, set by train B315, now coming out of the New Wales plant right behind B311. 315 is another dry rock shuttle train, this one bringing loads to Rockport from New Wales. But once again, the Bone Valley is all dark territory, so this current block of tract of Rico is occupied by B311. 315 won't be going anywhere until B311 clears the limits. So for the time being, B315 strolls out of New Wales and up to the north leg switch here at Edison, as it still is not responding to radio commands. They'd have to stop also to reline it for their move. Quite the inconvenience would be North Edison for the crews, almost like that rock in your shoe that you can never seem to get rid of. Two classic GE-8 wide cabs would be pulling this fairly short train of dry rock out of New Wales bound for Rockport transloading yard. Interestingly, today's B315 has had all of its product loaded into jumbo covered hoppers, and we'll explain in just a moment why that likely is. You could consider 315 as the B311 of New Wales. Both are shuttling dry rock to Tampa Bay. 315 is just a batch from the New Wales plant, while 311 is from Ridgewood. East Tampa, on the other hand, won't see any of its own dry rock trains, as the plant is already on the waterfront. Just a few weeks before, on the evening of May 17th, I'd end up catching another B315 fresh out of Mosaic, New Wales, with a train of dry rock phosphate. Now around 2 miles to the west of Edison, an old friend and I found ourselves at the crossing of Keysville Road this evening. Though to CSX folks and some rather old timetables, this location, or rather the switches not far from us, are recognized as Welcome Junction. Today's iteration of B315 would still be utilizing a train set of GR1 flip-top hoppers. Now, I say they still utilize as though that isn't the norm, but at this point it no longer is. Via a number of rumors I've heard from folks I know who either actively or formerly worked for Mosaic, the days may be numbered for the rotary dumper in service at Rockport Yard. As aforementioned, these GR1s were specially built for service specifically inside this rotary dumper, but as time has progressed and the rotary dumper reaches the end of its service life, rumor has it that after accounting for the extensive maintenance required on the rotary couplers on rail cars and the rotary dumper itself, that simply unloading via the bottom hopper doors on regular jumbo cars is a more cost-effective and faster method to use. So, in short, the B315 that we've just seen back there at Edison may be the first wave of what is to come of all domestic phosphate trains that may soon only use jumbo hoppers for transition to Rockport. Obviously, I can't say for sure, but if these GR1 cars are still running at the time I get this video posted, I'd say definitely get your shots of these while you can, just in case. About a quarter mile shy of this road crossing is the crossovers and switches that CSX refers to as Welcome Junction. While not a major junction or terminus of any kind, Welcome Junction is the beginning of the Plant City subdivision, branching off the Valrico sub here and running north to the Double Diamond at Plant City. Once upon a time, this subdivision allowed phosphate trains from the Bone Valley to access CF Industries' giant phosphate processing facility in Zephyr Hills. Unfortunately, CF Industries shuttered this facility in late 2018, and no trains have accessed it from the Bone Valley or the Plant City sub ever since. While the facility itself did see some business a few years later in the hands of a new company called Anuvia Plant Nutrients, that company too has since in fact gone totally out of business, and the plant is once again in a shuttered state. And since Anuvia never utilized the Plant City sub or the Bone Valley to import raw materials while in business, the Plant City sub, apart from a few local switchers that remain, has pretty much been barren of all rail action ever since the plant first closed in 2018. 12 miles north on the Plant City subdivision is downtown Plant City and the Plant City interlocking, where the Lakeland subdivision crosses both the Yeoman sub to Tampa and the Plant City sub to Welcome. While, as aforementioned, no more Bone Valley trains can be observed passing here, there are a couple of new trains that have been instated that you can see at the Diamond here. And once in a blue moon, you might see one of those trains passing through town on a late evening with a couple of Canadian locomotives in the lead. The practice of agriculture and feeding a global population is not an easy task, and so it's no surprise that the fertilizer that is required to grow those crops comes from around the world. Farmers around the world rely on Florida's phosphate fertilizer supply to grow their crops, but our Canadian brothers to the north also have a rather nutrient-rich substance in their possession called potash. While similar to Florida's phosphate in nutrient content, potash is more of a clay-like granule straight out of the ground. Both commodities are used as fertilizers, and Rockport Yard in Tampa has recently become the export location for Canadian potash trains. This evening's train, symboled B241, is hauling a nearly 6,000-foot-long shipment of potash from Saskatchewan all the way to Rockport for export overseas to the Caribbean. While the train is not directly related to the Bone Valley, it ultimately serves the same mission of growing crops to feed the global population, and is certainly a favorite amongst rail fans for the Canadian power it can often bring from our northern border. 9 miles south of the Plant City Diamond on the Yeoman subdivision is South End Valrico, where the Valrico subdivision from the Bone Valley converges, and our B315 from New Wales, who is also bound for Rockport Yard, now converges onto the Yeoman sub.
CSX detector milepost 2.2, no defect. Repeat, no defect. Total axle 208. Detector out.
As unique a location as Valrico is, it's never quite a convenience to use it. We're about 10 miles to the east of downtown Tampa and right in the center of Brandon, one of the many population centers and traffic light gardens of central Hillsborough County. Chasing any train towards Tampa from this area is always a challenge no matter what day it is, and 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday would not be any more forgiving than the others. So upon the chase of this train to Rockport, I'd inevitably get caught by the train again at the State Road 60 crossing just south of Yeoman Yard. In a perfect world, we say we might have beaten this train here, but doesn't always happen that way. And Tampa traffic is not forgiving, even on the weekend. So we do what we can, and this is what we get sometimes. I guess I just need to lighten up with the situation and find joy as the end of the train goes by. Barring a miracle, I was able to get ahead of the train again by the US 41 crossing at Rockport, and now around 3 miles to the south of Yeoman, 315 is now turning off the Tampa Terminal subdivision at Sutton siding at Rockport Y to head into the yard. For the third consecutive time now, B315 would cause another set of headaches on a major Tampa highway as they'd have to stop again to line switches into Rockport Yard. Lining switches better be something that this crew is very familiar with by this point today. And here we pretty much get a full aerial look at what Rockport looks like. Way in the back of the yard is the rotary dumper that may soon be out of commission, but ultimately is the transloading point for commodities from rail to ship. You'll notice in the back how closely the tracks butt up to the water's edge. You can actually note the earlier seen B311 still inside the yard getting their train unloaded as B315 pulls in. Rockport Yard was built in the 1960s by the Seaboard Coastline to alleviate the constant rail traffic that would beforehand run straight through downtown Tampa to the waters of Tampa Bay. This new yard effectively rerouted all Bone Valley traffic south of Tampa and out of downtown, as back in the 60s the Bone Valley ran close to 40 trains a day to Tampa Bay. And while Rockport remained as a major staging terminal and hump yard through the late 90s, it has since downsized to only the transload facilities and storage of rail cars. Though there has been some new business to come along and breathe some life back into Rockport, such as those Canadian potash trains. I still vividly remember the very late night in January of 2021 when they ran the first ever potash train from Canada down to here at Rockport. I caught them arriving this night just after 4 o'clock in the morning. And Rockport, even if transload practices inside are soon to change, won't be going anywhere anytime soon. The Bone Valley is still a very heavy business in this area, and the potash trains don't look to be going anywhere either. The way I see it, as I mentioned earlier, as long as people are still growing stuff and eating, these trains will still be running pretty steadily. Though in just a few minutes, while an eternity to those waiting at the crossing, 315 does get their move on into Rockport Terminal. Though I'd quickly become the one waiting as all the vehicle traffic began flowing, effectively trapping me in place for a good few minutes afterward. While still in this Tampa vicinity, there is one more Bone Valley train that I've just recently learned about that I'd like to cover for the end of this video. While not exactly the train in question, stumbling up to 78th Street just east of Yeoman Yard this Friday evening, I found train B301 rolling down the Tampa bypass track to tie down at the yard office.
Alright, EC1 number 74125, B30101, 1914, Richard, release my authority on all tracks from South Welcome to SAS, Southwest Rico. Alright, good release on this 1738 East and Tampa. 1738 here now, thank you.
Returning from the new Wales plant, 301 is hauling finished dry rock back to Mosaic's port at Big Bend on the Palmetto subdivision. Nearly adjacent to Tampa Electric, Big Bend is another one of the export locations on Tampa Bay for dry rock phosphate.
Guys, phosphate does not smell good. I can smell these cars from here. It smells like the back of a Home Depot.
Similar to the B315 consist, 301 is made up of all jumbo-covered hoppers as there is evidently no more rotary dumper in service at Big Bend. Big Bend doesn't see much traffic as compared to Rockport, receiving train loads only about once a week. The crew for this train that's been on duty since nearly 7 o'clock this morning is nearly out of time and won't make it to Big Bend and back before their shift is up. A new crew will take the train from here at Yeoman to Big Bend later tonight. Moving on slightly west and south to the State Road 60 crossing are the control points of TS. Once upon a time, the Atlantic coastline crossed the seaboard here and the crossing was called TS. The old name has been preserved in what today is the beginning of the Tampa Terminal and Palmetto subdivisions, the AZA line to Bradenton. The medium clear signal indication coming out of Yeoman on the right side is for this train, another wet rock shuttle from the Bone Valley.
It's B30701. When y'all get out of TS there, head down towards the south end Sutton. Find you a good spot to sit there. 783s, we're going to head there at Big Bend. They're trying to finish up and get out your way there.
Okay, go find somewhere to go sit and hang out.
Now wait a minute, something's not right here. This train is completely empty. There are no phosphate mines south of us on this AZA line to obtain the freshly mined wet rock phosphate, so where could this guy possibly be going with a completely empty train? Well, as the sun goes down, let's follow along and find out. 4 miles down the line, they'd be stopping to meet opposing L783 returning from Big Bend with a local train of boxcars after working National Gypsum. The slow clear at South End Sutton would direct them off the main into the siding at slow speed. The indication tells the crew to proceed at no more than 15 miles per hour through the switch and then at maximum authorized speed for the subdivision after the train is clear.
Stop leg, Sutton, north, main to the siding, out.
You're welcome. Just read. What's known Alphi River?
Alphi, please.
We're coming your way southbound. We're just making sure it's fine for us still.
Hey, yep, the Alphi still line and lock for you.
Alright, thanks much. And then we'll need the little Manatee too eventually.
Alright, once you get past here, I'll start landing a little Manatee up for you.
Alright, thank you much, sir.
The southbound B307 stays on the main between the switches as their train, while empty, is still way heavier than the opposing local train.
Robot looks good. Marker in place.
Appreciate it, sir. You guys have a good night.
I'll try. It's going to be a long one.
Here at South End Sutton, we're only about a mile south of the Y into Rockport Yard as it's located at the other end of Sutton around mile AZA 882. And with darker skies looming, B307 is very quickly back on the move south for Manatee County.
Hey, look good. Marker hanging there at 307.
Oh, you think you're better than me? Thanks.
Yeah, anytime.
This oddball wet rock job will cover nearly half of the AZA line before their trip is done, and with only 69 empties headed south, this train takes no time to get back up to speed. A speed that they would keep steady, now passing through Sun City just south of the Little Manatee River. Up until a rather very short time ago, you could never see wet rock gonds this far south on the now Palmetto subdivision. The train is headed for a point so far out of the way that I didn't even include it on my Bone Valley map as I was completely unaware of this service when I made it. The map only includes the Palmetto subdivision down to about North Ruskin, but 10 miles further than that is where this train is headed, a small yard along US 41 for the interchange to Port Manatee. And as never seen in previous years, there are 2 cuts of loaded wet rock gonds staged in the back of the yard awaiting pickup. Once upon a mere 5 years ago, Port Manatee used to be another export location for finished dry rock phosphate and would receive trains from New Wales about once a month.
07 on the CSX 52, 6 mile post AZA 905.2, reversed. By conductor iffy at 2020.
After a supposed mechanical failure with the port's unloader in late 2020, phosphate exports were redirected to Rockport and Big Bend. Rumor had it that repairs would be made within a year or two and trains would return, but such has not occurred, and now as we see in mid-2025, the process has actually completely reversed. Freshly mined wet rock phosphate is now being imported from overseas and being transloaded to rail here at Port Manatee. Now being retrieved by this nearly once weekly B307, the loads will be transported up and around to Mosaic's Ridgewood plant near Bartow for processing into dry rock. As far as the loading operations go, Mosaic does not have a presence here at Port Manatee, but rather the loading is handled by the small Port Manatee Railroad. They have a small fleet of 2 genset switchers that will retrieve cars from this interchange yard and either deliver them to miscellaneous customers inside the port, or in our case, load wet rock phosphate from arriving ships.
Alright, I'm gonna fry and clear on the bottom. Take it back on the hand.
Once the empties are set in the yard off the main line, the 2 AC-4400s run back to the north end of the yard to stack the 2 loaded cuts to return towards Ridgewood. In fading light, I'd set up at the county line road crossing just east of the yard at milepost AZA 905. Staring northeast down the continuous welded rail into the darkness is quite eerie considering the history that this line has. Former Tampa Southern, then Atlantic Coastline, then Seaboard Coastline before CSX, this route used to carry 70-mile-an-hour passenger trains to Sarasota and beyond on a daily basis. Nowadays, only seeing a handful of local switchers each week, though this B307 is a new addition to that roster, so this may be a good sign of business to come to Port Manatee and the greater Palmetto sub.
Alright, I'm on the ground clear, you really straight. Take it ahead. Follow us back down this way, RCX.
After around 30 minutes to assemble the loaded train, B307 now departs Port Manatee stacked with wet rock bound north for Bartow and the Ridgewood chemical plant. But an unspoken prevalent question remains. Why is Mosaic importing wet rock phosphate to Tampa Bay when we mine it right here in the state? Now, I'm all open to new information regarding this new business practice as I don't have full closure on the accuracy of the following information, but based on light research and some asking around, it's likely that the wet rock in these hoppers has just come overseas from Peru. Miski Mayo, a phosphate mining company and Mosaic's operating partner, is based in the Sechura Desert on Peru's northern coast. With an estimated 247 million tons of phosphate reserves, Miski Mayo mines and exports sifted wet rock overseas, and Mosaic has reportedly been processing rock from the South American company since 2010. Of course, that's what seems to be the most likely scenario based on what I could gather, so if anybody has more accurate information regarding this, please let me know in the comments. Moving a few miles north up the line, I'd catch the train again at the Little Manatee River, and even rail fans from 5 or 6 years ago may not recognize it now. What was once a manually operated swing bridge no longer has employees on site. The old sawed-off US&S signals that used to guard the span are gone, replaced by aluminum heads and a series of relay cases that now house modern RC electronics. Thanks to upgraded radio and remote systems, the bridge is now operated remotely by the Alafaya River Bridge tender near Tampa. No more do tenders need to be physically summoned to operate the bridge, which on one hand is certainly a convenience at 9:30 at night.
B307 Alpha Bridge, over. I hear you, 307. Alright, we're ready to come across the bridge, over. Alright, getting your little man in motion. Alright, thank you.
A verbal command and the push of a button puts the Little Manatee span into motion. With 5 sounds of the alarm, the span would be lined and locked, hands-free in about 5 minutes.
B307, yeah, Little Manatee is lined and locked for your forward movement. Alright, B307 answering, understand, Little Manatee line locked for our forward movement going on. Here we go.
The extra relay cases and LED lights do make for some helpful ambient lighting when catching trains at night here, but apart from that, they mostly just get in the way. Following US 41 back into Ruskin and into Apollo Beach, I'd head north for one final shot of the wet rock train crossing the Alafaya River near Gibsonton. Heading across the river and setting up the tripod on the pier at Williams Boat Ramp. While also providing a direct passageway to Tampa Bay, the Alafaya River also sees quite a bit of personal and pleasure boat traffic, and the boat ramp and recreational park here is where most folks will kick off their boats in the pre-dawn. The wooden fishing pier at the ramp also provides a good vantage point to see the Riverview processing plant where we started at the beginning of the video, where freshly mined Bone Valley phosphate is processed into dry rock fertilizer 24/7, 365. On the right days, you can also see the massive ships that dock right alongside the plant to retrieve that fertilizer, having just arrived off Tampa Bay. Turning back the other way, the pier also provides a good vantage to see CSX trains crossing the Alafaya swing span behind US 41, such as northbound B307, wet rock loads for Ridgewood Bartow. The aforementioned Alafaya bridge tender is stationed in an office just 300 feet from us on the north side of the river, and from that small building he can control every bridge on the Palmetto Sub, as well as the Hillsborough River Drawbridge in downtown Tampa. But the tender's office is just one of the copious amounts of features that keep things rolling over the rails of Florida's Bone Valley. In a world with a population that is ever increasing, Florida's phosphate industry will remain of extreme importance as it's required for the production of the fertilizers that keep the food growing. And this video only just scratches the surface on how the rail industry keeps this complex system moving from mine to fertile farmland.
All right, 307. West side of the train looks good. Markers in place. Have a good evening.
All right, thanks much for that. Roll by inspect.
All right, folks, that there is where we're going to conclude this hour-long cavalcade of Bone Valley coverage. Quite a unique industry that we have here in Central Florida, as seen here in the 21st century. Hopefully y'all were able to get a bit of a kick out of this one, as it's taken me a good few months to put together. And hopefully it's also given you a fairly good understanding of how the phosphate industry works and how the railroads of Central Florida are integrated into all of those processes. The industry itself, however, is quite vast, and like I said, this video only scratches the surface of the entire industry, so any topics or trains that may not have been fully covered or to as well of an extent as they could have been in this video, feel free to shoot me any questions, comments, concerns you may have to my general email or on the comment section of this video, because there's always a possibility I can make a video of any train in the BV covered deeper in the future. So like I said, let me know, but as it stands now, this video is done, and hopefully y'all enjoyed it, because it was a long one, but I enjoyed putting it together. So thank y'all for watching whatever you did, and until I see y'all next time somewhere, whether it be the Bone Valley or somewhere else in this ocean-lined state, see you somewhere else soon on the Sunshine State Rails.